shines a light on Hillgrove Farm, the greatest animal liberation action ever. The following is a reasonably brief recounting of one of the greatest examples of an animal liberation campaign in recent memory ever conducted. Whilst the beneficiary animal of this campaign was the humble feline, it was not taken up for the most part by cat-loving carnists whose animal-based morality begins and ends with the pets in their homes, but rather by committed and seasoned activists and veterans of the early forays into animal activism and liberation, who were committed to ending the barbaric practice of cesarean-derived kittens bound for laboratory experimentation at one particular location in the UK. This is the story of the closure of the Hillgrove Cat Farm. Hillgrove Cat Farm opened in 1970 after a local veterinarian, that's right, a veterinarian, had noticed the increasing demand for cats for laboratory experimentation and decided to get in on the action. Catherine, daughter of the original owner, was born into a family of veterinarians and vet nurses and was indeed a vet nurse herself before she married Christopher Brown, the two of which will play a significant role in the following story. Christopher Brown, a gruff and generally unpleasant fellow, took over the running of Hillgrove, situated near Witney in Oxfordshire. The Browns also grew crops on their sprawling 340-acre estate. It also contained a bed and breakfast which was routinely advertised in the national travel literature, the internet not around in any capacity at the time. The very idea that well-to-do road-weary travellers would escape to the Browns' bed and breakfast, completely unaware of the wanton cruelty taking place behind the farm shed walls, a likely reason why this particular portion of his business thrived. It's not like they advertised the cat torture on the brochure, and the guests were obviously unperturbed as to the nature of the activity behind the farm shed walls. Hillgrove Cats had been supplying kittens and cats to national vivisection labs for over a decade before the relative peace and prosperity of the farm was momentarily scuppered. In September 1981, Christopher Brown had imprisoned a number of activists operating in daylight who had trespassed onto the farm in the hopes of rescuing some cats. Brown had trapped them inside a shed using his tractor. 11 activists were arrested and charged. Their defence at trial was that they had rightly acted because what was taking place at the farm was wrong. The judge, no doubt a snobbish and sullen fellow who had no time for such idealistic notions as kindness to animals, disagreed, charging 10 of them, handing them each a fine and a lengthy suspended prison sentence. These notions, newly introduced to the media through the exposure that the trial was given, highlighting the idea that a nation of cat lovers, as Britain would obviously claim to be, would sit idly by whilst animals were being repeatedly bred into existence for the express purpose of being tortured and killed. It seems many people's notion of the worth of cats seemingly ended where medical progress began. That being said, Britain had always had a very strong and vocal anti-vivisection community, stretching back centuries. For over a decade, the Browns were again left to their devices and thousands of cats were bred and killed. In 1993, upon opening a parcel addressed to him, a device exploded which reportedly caused burns to Christopher Brown's chest and face, an act for which the Save Hillgrove Cats campaign organisers would repeatedly condemn. A few more years of inactivity passed, as activists looked elsewhere, seeking redress to the ongoing animal holocaust. 1997, and a significant number of UK activists were energised and looking for the next campaign, their next target as it were, the next opportunity for change. Hillgrove was top of the list. Hillgrove, as mentioned, had received sporadic interest in the decades since it had opened. Lead activists knew that the success of the campaign hinged on the fact that any action must be seen through to the end. Marching for a day, leafleting here and there, was not going to bring about the kind of change they wanted, the kind of change they were now growing accustomed to. The 800 to 1,000 cats kept inside Hillgrove deserved better. They would receive it, and it is here in which we pick up our story. The humble feline is a peculiar yet affectionate animal, and a puzzling and precocious addition to countless households around the world. The relatively short gestation period and ample litter size make them a particular favourite animal for vivisectors. Below rats and mice, of course. Christopher Brown saw himself, perhaps unsurprisingly for anyone who has ever spoken to someone enmeshed in the industries of animal exploitation, as an animal lover and something of an industry hero. If it wasn't for me, the industry would be full of backyard cowboys stealing animals off the streets, Brown said. Myself personally, I've always found this particular area of vivisection endlessly frustrating and amusingly ironic. Most first world countries have laws against using unwanted animals, cats and dogs, for experimentation. The idea of a homeless animal eliciting a suitable empathetic response to ensure they never see the inside of a lab, just the green in the needle and the liquid disappear into their vein. The idea that animals are purposely bred to die, yet these same animals are allowed to die for no other reason than no one wants them, is both appalling and unnecessary. A strange indictment on humanity's cognitive dissonance. Of course, most people are aware and can visit the sad animals staring out of a cage at an animal shelter. Not many people have to bear witness to the horrors of a vivisection laboratory. That said, the industry does have a long history of smuggling and stealing. Breeding is the answer, it seems. According to the Home Office, licenses were granted for 1,446 experiments involving cats in 1997, of which 469 used cats bred by the research establishments themselves, and 977 used cats from Hillgrove Farm. They were indeed the only game in town. Before the arrival of the Hillgrove Cats campaign and the protesters, the cat farm was worth £100,000 annually to the Browns, with a workforce 10 strong. After the campaign had kicked off, with protests and demonstrations, Brown appeared in the media as boastful and assured. He had seen others come and go. This time would be no different. Time would tell how long this would last. One elderly lady had often sat alone in a wheelchair with a placard out front, calling for an end to the violence. If Christopher Brown thought that this was all they had in store, he had another think coming. His employees and himself initially taking endless enjoyment in the presence of protesters, shouting and jeering at them. As the months passed, Brown installed a panic button on his property, and the local police force, the Thames Valley Police, became involved. A whole operation, codenamed Style, given over to the singular goal of protecting cat abuser Brown and his unwilling charges from the protesters. A police radio mast being installed upon his chimney. Many first-time activists, thinking that their police force was on the side of justice and decency, left shocked at the intimidatory tactics of the police. Many peaceful and lawful people had their images of the police forever altered in the initial stages of the campaign, as the officers began to assert themselves as thugs in uniform, though as the saying goes, they ain't seen nothing yet. An earlier raid, shortly before the commencement proper of the campaign, and to coincide and support activist Barry Horn, whom was currently incarcerated and on hunger strike, had rescued several cats whom were now living a comfortable life somewhere in suburbia. The offenders and their cats were tracked down, with 9 activists charged, and the cats returned to their captor. Brown, who appeared to lap up the media attention during their trial, and not the smartest cookie in the jar, was soon to have the tide of public opinion take a turn against him. Defence lawyers for the activists put Brown and his workers on the stand, asking repeated questions as to the treatment the cats received at his hands and the treatment they received from the vivisectors he sold them to. Brown and the workers squirmed during some of the questioning, though still appeared oblivious as to the damage their reputation was taking. The happy cat image that Brown had crafted for himself within an unquestionable media to this point was battered, his character further tarnished by his own admission that 2 of the cats returned to him after the raid, Margaret and Pebbles, had reached the end of their breeding lives, and he had killed them shortly before the trial. Pebbles herself had given Brown 12 litters. The truth was coming out. Defence lawyers doing a bang-up job, with several of the activists cleared of their charges, with only one activist, Kevin Hickey, being charged with holding stolen property, and was sentenced by Judge Tickle, yes, Judge Tickle, to a year behind bars, making the oft-repeated claim that the activists stressed the animals out, and that they were better off at Hillgrove. Smart chap. Kevin Hickey then proceeded to make trouble for the authorities at Her Majesty's Prison Service, demanding vegan food upon his incarceration. The Browns' bed and breakfast business summarily dried up after the trial, as the general public became aware of what was going on behind the walls of Hillgrove, and decided to spend a romantic getaway somewhere cats weren't being abused. Of course, for those unaware of the reputation of the farm, there was always the fireworks, air horns, and nightly flybys from the Thames Valley Police helicopter to keep them occupied. Christopher Brown had started to slip. A local church-going friend of his named Jack, who was of some influence within the local community, had arranged for the Thames Valley Police to set up roadblocks and barring orders within a 5-mile exclusion zone around his property. This was only the second time that this had been implemented on mainland Britain, though the post-9/11 government-induced terrorist state would see it becoming a more regular occurrence. As protesters prepared to descend on the house for a day of lawful protest, They were greeted by a heavy police presence under the mistaken belief that this was to be the end of their protests and the campaign was over. The protesters instead, making lemonade out of lemons, took their message to the streets of Oxford, as the police scrambled to react to the change of tactics by the 500-strong group. The people of Oxford, and indeed a nation, awoke that day, as locals, never before witnessing such a police presence within their city, began to question the use of police powers and the waste of taxpayer expenses to protect one business, which was of no particular significance to the local economy or the interest of Oxford in general. In fact, many were against it. Many noted how the Thames Valley Police were now a private security firm for the Browns. It goes right to the core of policing, says Thames Valley Police's Richard Goodfellow, which is to maintain law and order. Fair justification, though the disconcerted public were of a different opinion. Thames Valley Police Press Officer Janet Malcolmson was called upon several times to defend the actions of police officers that day who had not only acted like brutish goons towards protesters, but had arrested 2 press photographers and a TV camera crew. Press cards are forged by animal activists and they pose as reporters, said Malcolmson, in response to the police claims that protesters are posing as journalists. Photojournalist Andrew Tester said, "The only people posing as anything else are the police, when they dress up as activists." Undercover police, later identified as Metropolitan Police from London, were witnessed disguised and gathering footage of activists protesting lawfully. Thames Valley Police Force's coffers depleted after months of Operation Style went cap in hand to hire authorities for extra funding to continue their campaign. Myself personally, I have always loved the expression cap in hand. I can just picture it now. Some buffoonish tubby copper holding out his silly hat with a cartoonish sad face like a smacked ass, as some higher government minister throws some coins at him and waves him away with a hand. The copper scrambles to pick up the coins and scrambles out like a kid with a lollipop. Of course, it's far more sinister than that, but still. It was around this time that the people of Britain, chanting "We won't get fooled again" by the Who, resoundingly got fooled again as they voted in New Labour, and thus got done up like a kipper. Again. Weapons of mass destruction, anyone? Rampant austerity measures, anyone? National sell-offs, anyone? Not only this, Labour had promised to ban the LD50 test, as well as ban alcohol, tobacco, and weapons tests on primates. Needless to say, they got fooled again, and the government, with gold medal speed, backflipped on their campaign promises and watered them down so far as to drown anything of significance. But hey, they did finally get around to banning hunting 8 years later and really piss off the posh toffs. And 1997 became 1998. Speaking of passing laws, the Protection from Harassment Act, signed into law in 1998, whose stated aim was protecting women from the unwanted advances of uncouth gents. As is the case with so many laws of such a nature, they are intentionally left open to interpretation, leading many human rights and activist groups to state the laws could and would be used against legitimate campaigns and protest. 4 weeks later, Brown had been given protection under the Act, with no named activists being able to protest, communicate with, or appear anywhere near the Browns' property, with a lot of legal rigmarole attached to it, with the intention to intimidate people into giving up. Fines, asset seizure, and a 5-year prison sentence were all listed as punishment. In the process of achieving this, for a select few named activists, Brown had spent £5,000 in legal fees to achieve the ruling, and had racked up £30,000 in security costs. The Browns were beginning to struggle, and all other activists exploited loopholes inside the law. Once again, this is a common tactic amongst lawmakers, signing laws into precedent in order to quell or eliminate legal means of protest. Whilst the Browns may not have had the financial clout to legally disrupt all protest, larger companies with seemingly bottomless funds at their disposal could, and it was on the books now. A year in, and the police bill for the Browns' farm had surpassed £1 million. The local community reacted with shock and outrage, demanding a fairer go for the other citizens of the community who had seen the quality and quantity of police support they were receiving drop off a cliff in order to protect a cat abuser. The activists, looking to seize upon the growing unease between local residents and the police force and Hillgrove Farm, upped the ante, utilising their 8,000-strong activist mailing list like never before, the days of communicating by post, and arranged for extra demonstrations, calling for certain regional groups to pick a day in which they would all travel to Oxford together for a demonstration. This coincided with national demonstrations every 2 months, and local daily and nocturnal demonstrations, including visits to workers' homes. 1 year in, and Christopher Brown was contemplating his once steadfast position. Word had it that he would consider selling for £200,000, claiming to have £100,000 worth of stock. It would have been a sound investment for the Thames Valley Police, who, from an economic standpoint, should have had his arm off to sign on the dotted line. The policing bill would only continue going one way, and it wasn't down. Brown was reported to have said, "We are existing, not living." But Christopher Brown was a stubborn man. If only he had implemented this trait to the betterment of others, it would have been admirable. World Day 1998, and a litany of protesters, 2,000 strong, descended upon Oxfordshire from all over the country. They filled trains, buses, private coaches and vehicles, all making their way to Oxfordshire with hope in their heart and determination writ large that they would see this vile place shut down. Imagine those numbers, dear listeners, arriving from all over the country in the name of shutting down one business. What a sight it must have been. However, the police had a surprise in store. Activists arriving early to the Hillgrove farm were stunned to find that a 10-foot-high steel fence had been hastily erected around the entirety of the Brown household and cat farm. Guard towers rising above the 10-foot frame at the perimeter, allowing police or security staff to keep a watchful eye on the activists, who would soon amass on the road and green verges. 4,000 feet whose only view was of a wall of solid grey and the grey sky above, the structure being amassed literally overnight, confirmation arriving later that the police had not even sought planning permission before the structure went up. Not only this, but roadblocks had been set up at various junctions around the city with the express purpose of delaying those buses and cars from arriving at their destination. Thuggish police demanding entry into buses armed with powerful spotlights that they shone in people's faces, videotaping all and verbally blasting anyone with the temerity to question their presence. Those who tried to cover their faces for anonymity were prevented from doing so, having a camera literally shoved in their face. When arriving at their destination, frustrated and late, activists were again detained and individually photographed by police, their details noted. The police were compiling a laundry list of activists in attendance, for which would later come in handy. Tactics like these really only have one result, making people already feeling embittered and determined even angrier, which, despite the police's statements to the contrary, was their true motive that day, as we shall see. Of course, activists have two choices when confronted with such flagrant abuse of power and intimidatory tactics: put up or shut up. Needless to say, it's pretty obvious which one they chose that day. The downside of erecting such a mammoth structure so hastily was all the mess it would leave behind. All this rubble and countless rocks just lying there, at the feet of thousands of pissed-off activists. You don't need to be Nostradamus to figure out what happened next. Over the course of a few hours, Hillgrove Farm resembled a battlefield, as activists threw anything that was capable of becoming airborne over the fence and towards the Brown household, and all within the view of 300 or so heavily clad police in riot gear, who sat about and watched it unfold. The fence was momentarily breached, and was the only time in which the police were truly called into action. No one would be stealing any cats today. The sheer weight of numbers of police across such a small area of down fence saw the fence eventually back in place, with no activists getting through. Other activists made a battering ram, and some attempted to dig their way in. All told, by the end of the day, no cats were liberated, though the Brown household resembled something from downtown Basra, in which Tony Blair's lies had helped to create. In total, 80 windows were broken and the roof was destroyed. For those of you who have experience in or witnessed stage-managed police actions in the past, this was a common tactic in which many activists, not taking precaution to mask their identity, fell for. And whilst the police stood back and allowed the activists who relocated a lot of Mother Earth from one side of the fence to the other, their dossier of attending activists was being put to good use. Over the following weeks and months, activists were arrested at work, at demonstrations, and even during early morning raids. Surely the front door at a decent hour would have sufficed, lads. The photos of dangerous activists being led away in their pyjamas does assist to interest the media, who, let's be frank, needed little additional motivation. Many of the arrested activists would do time behind bars. To make short mention of the so-called legal means of protest, though it should be noted that for the most part, the entire Hillgrove campaign was entirely legal. 200,000 people signed a petition before the days when anyone could add an electronic signature to a petition within seconds, without a second thought for the cause. This petition was the result of countless hours of manpower and public goodwill. Not only this, but 48 MPs had signed a motion condemning establishments breeding cats for the vivisection industry. In retaliation to the police's tactics and the manner in which arrests were being made, Brown's Range Rover was burnt out one evening as it sat by the house, as well as some newly repaired windows being smashed. A nationally coordinated campaign of phone-ins to the Browns' residents had seen their phone lines jammed for days at a time, when there were telephone poles standing for the calls to come in on, that is. A call-in, for those unaware, is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A considerable number of activists keep phoning in and jam the lines to prevent any form of business being done. There was also a considerable amount of unsolicited mail arrive at the Browns' residence, and there was still, of course, the fireworks that had a nasty habit of going off in the middle of the night when the Browns were trying to sleep. The once cocksure and bemused workforce of what still remained continued to resign, for which their part in proceedings came to an end. The Browns, unwilling to give up as quickly as their staff had done, were continuing to hold firm, however barely, as 1998 disappeared into 1999. Random arrests at another demonstration, including guest speakers whilst they were on stage, as well as those standing by them, threw further fuel on a fire that was simmering after the previous police standoff on either side of the fence and the arrests that had followed. The police later released those arrested without charge, having arrested them without cause, another familiar police tactic used to delay or deny protesters appearing at certain events and actions. For anyone with any sympathy for the police at this point, there really is no explanation for this particular move, other than to procure a reaction, and they certainly got one. Later that night, the ALF struck, burning out 4 poultry and 17 dairy trucks from 2 separate companies, to the tune of £1 million. As the campaign closed in on the 2-year mark, the policing bill had exceeded £5 million, seeing 350 people arrested and 21 sent to prison. Months passed, with the pressure maintained upon the Browns and their farm. The cats, oblivious to all the fanfare inside their prison, had came and went with the same regularity as they had done for decades prior. Though as 1999 progressed, the advertisements in the medical literature and the usual outlets for vivisectors looking to acquire animals to suit their dark purposes began to fade, and then disappear completely. The finish line was almost in sight. Brown's once strong and proud stance for the media had been replaced by a largely defeated, dishevelled man. You could almost feel sorry for him, had he not resolutely stuck to his laurels of loving animals whilst selling them on to their terrible fate, though someone within the campaign had made a rather shrewd observation. It was always Christopher Brown out front, his wife being largely left to her role as director and secretary behind the scenes. Someone decided to give her a more starring role, and so Catherine Brown, who had a regular routine of walking the dog in the woods near the house, was accosted by a number of individuals. She was unharmed, but was left tied to a fence post. 2 months later, it was all over. An activist with a sympathetic friend working inside the RSPCA had passed on the message that the charity, with far more blood on their hands than Hillgrove cats could ever hope to achieve, if we are being honest, was asked to take in 800 cats. Campaign organisers knew this meant one thing, and one thing only. So on one balmy night in August 1999, 30 RSPCA workers, operating under the cover of darkness, entered into Hillgrove Farm and took away some 800 cats in 16 vans to rehoming centres across the country. How many of the 800 cats were adopted out is unknown. In a bittersweet moment at the climax of the campaign, the RSPCA, the only animal organisation who had not only refused to support or positively acknowledge the campaign, but had in fact openly condemned it, were plastered across the front pages of the media, receiving praise for having taken the cats into care. The charity setting up a hotline for anyone wishing to offer a home to one of the cats and kittens who would have otherwise ended up dismembered or disposed of in some pitiful lab trash bag somewhere across the UK. Never one to pass up the opportunity to self-aggrandise, Christopher Brown was interviewed for his part in the story, true to form to the end, saying he had not given in to the animal rights activists, but at the age of 61 was merely retiring, also adding, They were lovely cats, and I enjoyed caring for them. I hope they will be appreciated in their new homes. I would be upset if anyone were to treat them badly. Such a gentle old soul at heart. Apart from Brown's apparent burns in 1993, the only people harmed throughout the 2-year campaign were the activists. The animal rights militia had added Christopher Brown's name to a list of vivisectors and other animal abusers who would be assassinated should Barry Horn's hunger strike in prison result in his death, though the threats of violence never eventuated. Several protesters had claimed that they had been poisoned whilst lawfully protesting outside the farm on a grass verge where they were wont to often stand. The Environmental Health Organisation had found substantial amounts of dimethoate, a potentially lethal pesticide where the activists had been standing. 16 activists suffered from nausea, headaches, sore throats, and had difficulty breathing, though all recovered without issue. Christopher Brown said that he did not use dimethoate and had nothing to do with their supposed poisoning. There were other ways in which the toxic substance may have gotten there, though the most likely of reasons would seemingly have sinister motivations. And it is here in which the matter rests. Hillgrove was the last facility in the UK to breed cats specifically for scientific research, though by no means does that mean that experiments on cats are not occurring still within the UK and elsewhere around the world. Nearly 20 years on from the closure of the farm, those young cats and kittens liberated from a world of apathy and indifference, never knowing their luck. For those few likely to still be with us, there is a legacy to remember and pass down to the new breed of animal rights activists who should look to stand upon the shoulders of those stalwart individuals who came before us and take the plight of all animals worldwide right where it belongs, right smack bang in the uncomfortable glare of the public conscience. There is a vegan world coming, my friends, and the best way to avoid being overwhelmed by the problem is to become part of the solution. Let's give 'em hell. Until next time.